What if your IT service desk helped you put your customers first? It can happen when it's powered by the world's most trusted cloud platform. Industry leaders BMC Software and Salesforce.com offer the fastest growing IT service management solution in the market today, Remedyforce. Let's meet Sally. Last week, Sally requested an iPhone by logging a ticket using the hashtag request capability, found exclusively in Remedyforce. IT got a request, and Sally got her iPhone. All was good until her mobile email stopped working. No worries. Sally jumps on to the Remedyforce self-service portal, and before submitting a service request, she checks out the articles section and quickly finds a possible solution to her problem by resetting her phone. Sally finds easy-to-follow, step-by-step instructions on how to remove and reinsert her SIM card. In this case, resetting her iPhone didn't work, so Sally decides to get help from IT. She gives some information about her problem and submits the service ticket. It's instantly routed to a service desk agent. Now, as an agent, you can start to get more information about Sally's problem. You can quickly tell if there's a problem on a larger scale. Right away, you notice there's planned maintenance. And diving deeper, you see there's a problem associated with the server and email on mobile devices. It also looks like someone has already issued a request for change, so you check out the latest status. Good news! There's a rollout plan, a backup plan, and information about who approved the change. It looks like Sally's email will be back up and running in no time. That makes Sally happy, and you a hero. Email is just one of the many critical business services your customers rely on. And with Remedyforce, you can monitor the status of any business or IT service at a glance. Deployment is fast and easy with no hardware or software to manage. Upgrades are automatic, so you'll always be on the newest version with the latest features. And Remedyforce is accessible to customers anywhere, anytime, on any device. Keep your employees happy and your business thriving. Try Remedyforce today.
Good afternoon, TFT14 listeners. I'm Korrine Jones from OD Consulting in Brisbane, Australia, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you today on the topic of virtual reality, overcoming the challenges of remote working to create high-performing virtual ITSM teams. Now, unlike many of your presenters today, I'm not an ITIL expert. My background is actually in organisational development and HR, and I specialise in optimising the productivity and performance of ITSM teams and a range of other teams as well. So I'm just going to now flip across to my screen, share my screen here so that you can see my presentation as I work my way through. So in terms of my presentation today, I'm going to start with some definitions and history, specifically around virtual teams, the term and its background. I'm then going to tell you a little bit about today's grim reality, the statistics in terms of the number of virtual teams that are actually succeeding. I'm then going to talk a little about the business imperative, why so many organisations and ITSM teams are becoming virtual or dispersed. And then I'll move on to my research. So I'll provide a snapshot of my research, but then really spend time looking at what are the unique challenges that these types of teams face, what are the challenges that I've found among my clients and a number of organisations that I have interviewed for case studies for my research, and finish by looking at what are the critical success factors for high-performing virtual ITSM teams using a range of practical examples from the organisations that I work with. I'll also, along the way, draw on some recent research and statistics around virtual teams, their challenges, and their success. So what is a virtual team? Now, this is my definition. It's a group of individuals who work together across time, space, and organisational boundaries and communicate via technology. Now, the slide that I'm bringing up here now identifies from an RW3 study back in 2012 just how often dispersed or virtual teams tend to meet. And you'll see that almost half of them never meet. About 30% of them meet once a year, and only a small few have the luxury of meeting more often than that. So these are teams that are dispersed, but if they're lucky, only get to meet face-to-face now and then. So a couple of definitions. The terms dispersed team, distributed team, remote team are all used interchangeably, and today I will use the term virtual team for all of those types of teams. I'll also talk about remote workers, and they are team members who are not co-located with their team leader or not co-located with other team members. Now, Lipnack and Stamps were the first to really write about virtual teams, and I think they also coined the term virtual teams around about 30 years ago. Since then, each of these companies, all IT companies, and a range of others have been using virtual or remote teaming probably for up to 20 years or so now. And with the proliferation of social media and web-based tools, there is an exponential growth in virtual teaming at the moment. Now, on that, a study undertaken in the United States by the Society of Human Resources back in 2012 identified that 46% of organisations use virtual teams in their workplaces. If we look at multinationals, 68% are using virtual teams, and US-based operations at that stage, about 28% of them were using virtual teams. Also, some very recent research by Gartner indicates that 75% of project teams globally are now working virtually. Now, a virtual team comes in many shapes and sizes. It could range from maybe a couple of your team working from home or working remotely a couple of days a week, right through to entire teams spanning divisions, states, countries, continents, and organisational boundaries. I suppose at the most complex end, you might have your process managers in your host company, your service desk manager in a partner company, and then technical staff employed by your vendor providing critical incident support around the globe via Follow the Sun support. So they can take on a wide range of forms and come in many shapes and sizes. Now, if we look at the current success rates of virtual teams, the picture's not great at the moment. Up to 87% of the global workforce is now working remotely at least part of the time. Now, this comes from that 2012 study undertaken by RW3. It included 3,300 respondents across 102 countries. Now, you might note that that percentage is higher than the percentages that I provided before. This is because this is including not just totally virtual teams, but those teams that have one or two people operating remotely for part of the week or part of the time. Now, of those virtual teams, fairly high statistics there, 40% of virtual team members stated in this survey that they feel that their teams are underperforming. Now, from that same research, team members talked about what they find most challenging about working virtually. And you'll notice here from the slide that managing conflict, making decisions, and expressing opinions are those things that are coming up as most challenging. And it stands to reason, if we're not sitting next to people, if we can't have those face-to-face conversations around decisions, around issues in the team, it is going to be much more challenging. It's interesting to note, though, that delivering quality output and generating innovative ideas is considered to be equally complex, whether we happen to be working face-to-face or whether we are operating virtually. So I'm now going to just give you a small glimpse of the research that I've undertaken. Now, this has included my consulting and training clients over the past number of years, plus I've gathered a range of case studies through one-on-one and team interviews of virtual team leaders, team members and organisations across a range of industries. So they span from micro business right through to large multinationals, and cross a wide range of industries: IT, banking, direct sales, retail, public sector, e-learning providers. As I've mentioned, there are ITSM teams in amongst those. And my research has identified what are the challenges that keep coming up time and again. But most importantly, what are the things that work? What are the critical success factors? And what are specifically some of the practical things that we can do to increase the success of our virtual teams? Now, there are a range of business imperatives for operating in this way. For a start, by having our teams operating virtually, we can reduce our accommodation costs, particularly if we have some of our team members working from home, telecommuting or teleworking. We also have reduced travel costs because team members aren't having to either travel, relocate to take up a role, or travel for meetings, etc. And there is some evidence around that virtual teaming provides increased productivity. For example, Xilinx has reported an increase in engineering productivity of around 25% through online collaboration. And all of these lead to increased revenue. We're also at the moment, and including within the ITSM space, seeing quite a lot of cross-organisational partnering, which by nature then creates virtual and dispersed teams. On the employee side of things, virtual teams are fabulous in terms of attracting and retaining talent. We're able to tap into such a wide talent pool because people don't need to move to take up a role. They can work from wherever they happen to be around the globe. There's research to suggest that virtual teaming can also increase your employee engagement, and engagement is a huge issue worldwide at the moment. A very recent Gallup study identified that only 13% of the global workforce are engaged. So anything that can increase engagement is going to make good business sense. Also, though, work-life balance has been reported as increasing with virtual teaming as well. So all of these lead to happier staff, increased morale, which leads to increased productivity, and then, of course, increased profitability. But to be able to derive these benefits from virtual teams, we need to be able to manage the unique challenges that come with remote working. So we're going to, first of all, go back 8 years to 2006 and have a look at the results of a study by Horowitz, Bravington and Silvers in terms of what were the challenges of virtual teaming back then. So we had poor communication quality as fairly high there, along with time zones and time differences, also cultural differences, commitment from team members, and a lack of technical problems rated fairly highly. Now, our technology has moved an enormous way in the last 8 years. So it'd be interesting to see how different that is now when we pop forward to our current statistics. Also, though, poor management and leadership, the challenges of coordinating information, resources and meetings, not having the benefit of meeting face-to-face, and a lack of response to communications, which can then create some breakdowns in communication. So it links back up to that poor communication quality, but it can also create issues around trust. So now that we do have a lot more technology available to us, let's have a look at what the challenges are. So still, we see management and leadership. And what I have found from my research is that because management and leadership applied in the traditional way doesn't work, this can be really challenging for the leaders of virtual teams. A lack of trust comes up time and time again, which creates issues around achievements, but also issues around collaboration, communication within the team. Communication breakdowns are still coming up very prevalently. Also, isolation and lost team members, which I will explain a little bit more in a moment. The absence of rich water cooler conversations, those incidental conversations where we build rapport, where so much creativity occurs, don't happen. Time zones, again, and still are a big issue, particularly if our team is spread globally across continents. And a new one that we have now, which wasn't in that research 8 years ago, was 24/7 connectivity. So let's look at each one of these challenges in a little more detail. Oh, cross-cultural challenges and clashes. I'm so sorry, I forgot to add that one. Also a really big issue back 8 years ago, but also still a big issue now. So let's start by looking at management and leadership. So leadership is in the virtual environment is different. We can't lead people in the same way. And I suppose my experience has been that many team leaders are really uncomfortable with managing people that they can't see on a day-to-day basis. In addition to this, some of the elements of management, such as providing feedback, undertaking performance reviews, are really quite difficult to do remotely. For example, I recently interviewed the member of a national virtual team as part of my research. And she talked about 2 examples where she had received constructive, so not all positive, feedback from her team leader via telephone. On each occasion, she was actually quite taken aback by the feedback that she received and needed to take a couple of moments to collect her thoughts and to manage her emotional responses. So there was silence on her end of the phone. However, her team leader was uncomfortable with this silence and very promptly wound up the conversation and hung up on her, leaving her feeling very taken aback once again. And she talked about how this really damaged the relationship that she had with this team leader and eroded the trust that they had created. So it's different, and we need to find different ways to do these things effectively. A lack of trust. Is it possible to build real trust with somebody without face-to-face contact? A study that Ferrazzi wrote about in Harvard Business Review back in 2012 found that the lack of face-to-face contact does make it really tough to build trust. And I've personally found that failure to build real trust can be the key ingredient in the demise of a virtual or dispersed team. Communication breakdowns are still coming through as a strong challenge for these teams. It's interesting that Lipnack and Stamps, who have researched extensively around virtual teams, found that people who are more than 50 feet apart rarely communicate with each other, even if they're in the same office. So expand that out to a team that's spread around the globe or across organisations, and you'll find that a myriad of blockages, filters, misinterpretations occur. And so this lack of clear communication, one, can cause individual team members to be sidetracked on less important tasks, but can also result in conflicts and tension across the team. Team members can become lost in a couple of different ways. From a remote worker's point of view, they often report feeling isolated from the rest of the team, left out of communications and decision making, particularly if other members of the team are co-located and just one or two of them are working remotely. From the team leader's point of view, remote team members can be forgotten, out of sight, out of mind, and therefore left out of communication processes, or worse still, team leaders can become suspicious about what their team members are up to if they're not at their workstation, not responding to electronic messaging, or not answering the phone. There's also the absence of those water cooler conversations that I referred to earlier. Now, it's at the water cooler, in the hallway, in the kitchen, where we tend to have those incidental conversations around, well, how was your weekend? How's the week going? What are you up to this weekend? Those chats are really important in building rapport and trust across the team. They're also where spontaneous creativity often occurs, with a little bit of a, informal chat and banter. And these opportunities just don't arise in virtual teams. So they need to find another way to replicate this really important communication. And then we have our time zones and 24/7 connectivity. Finding a suitable time slot for a web meeting or a teleconference, whether it's your daily stand-up, a change advisory board meeting, it can be really challenging when you have your team members spread across continents. While a number of on-call incident managers are probably used to doing the night shift from time to time, the occurrence of out-of-hours meetings can really escalate with a geographically spread team. And this 24/7 connectivity impacts on our home lives. It also can impact on our health. A number of recent studies have identified that being connected 24/7 creates stress, which then can create illnesses such as heart disease, and there are even some links to cancer. So they are the challenges that I have found come up frequently with the virtual teams that I work with and those that I have interviewed as part of my research. And the other really important one that comes up very often is cultural clash. Culturally inappropriate interactions with the team cause breakdowns in communication and make it really difficult to build rapport and trust. Cultural cringes will also increase tension across the team. And a number of the virtual teams I've been working with are spanning organisational as well as national boundaries. And so there is organisational culture clash as well as national culture clash, and it is becoming quite an issue for a lot of the teams that I work with. So let's look at the critical success factors. What are the things that teams are finding work? What are the things that teams are finding important to their success? And I'll also go through some examples, some practical examples of what teams are doing. So in terms of the critical success factors, they fall under a couple of major headings. First one is leadership. We'll look at how we can lead virtually, how we can manage our remote workers more effectively, team development, engagement of individual team members, and team communication. So if we think about our team leaders, they need to lead in a different way, but it's actually quite shocking to see that this 2012 study by RW3 found that 84% of their organisations do not train staff for virtual teaming. So they don't train their team members and they don't train their team leaders, which is really quite concerning given that it's very different to lead a team in this way. A statutory authority that I studied last year actually does take this quite seriously, and they put their virtual team leaders and managers through a virtual leaders development program which spans 6 months. During that 6 months, they provide some face-to-face training. They also provide a toolkit of resources, readings. They have regular webinars, provide opportunities for virtual leaders to connect with other virtual leaders, and they provide mentoring. And they have found that this training has increased the effectiveness of their team leaders, virtual team leaders, significantly. Many of the virtual team leaders that I work with and interview refer to selecting people with the right fit. And the attributes that come up most often are they want self-starters, so people who are comfortable working on their own and getting started on their pieces of work. Those who are tech savvy, so those who are comfortable in using technology predominantly to communicate. Those who are willing and happy to work autonomously, but at the same time will be proactive in reaching out to collaborate with their team members. Now, once we've selected the right people, we also need to look at how do we integrate them into the team? And we need to think about induction and training. One virtual company, a logistics company that I've just been doing some work with, take this really seriously. They bring their new starters into their head office for about the first 3 weeks, and they use that time to provide them with an induction and the training that they need, so that once they do head out and work remotely, and they all pretty well all work from home, they'll be able to do that effectively and know the processes and know their roles, etc., to be able to get up to speed quickly. I hear very frequently that to be effective, virtual team members need very clear direction at both team and individual levels to guide their day-to-day work and to keep them connected to the big picture. So this includes having very clear goals, objectives, timelines, and plans. Now, ideally, these would be collaboratively developed so that you've got buy-in and understanding from all of the team members, and also stored in a place where they can be readily accessible for anybody who needs to access them. The slide right at the beginning of the presentation that looked at how often virtual teams meet indicated that only about 46% of virtual teams meet face-to-face at all. At the same time, research has found that a face-to-face meeting up front will really speed up the trust building and collaboration within a virtual team. Now, just two examples of organisations that take this seriously that I can share with you. One's a global IT company who have a range of virtual teams operating globally, and they bring these teams together for annual conferences and use these conferences for objective setting, for planning, and for team development. Another team that I worked with last year, a statewide based team, have the luxury of bringing the whole team together every 2 months. They initially used this for planning, but continue to use it for team development, organisational review of team outcomes, and as the setting for complex and sensitive discussions and conversations. And both of these organisations have found that this has really increased the success of their virtual teams. To be able to work effectively in a remote location, our team members need to be empowered to do so with clear direction, with the tools they need, with clear processes, and the autonomy to make decisions and to work effectively. Promoting input to planning and problem solving can be really useful in increasing empowerment. The leader of a direct marketing team that I interviewed last year with a team spread across the Asia Pacific focuses heavily on empowering her team members. She talks about empowering rather than enabling them. And she does that with a solid induction, regular training opportunities, very clear guidelines and processes, and then she leaves the ball in their court, and she finds that it works brilliantly in terms of empowering them to achieve their sales targets autonomously. So they are the critical success factors under the topic of leadership. What I'm going to look at now is how can we manage remote workers more effectively. So as I mentioned earlier, managing people remotely requires a different approach. So some of the things that I found work really well. A study in 2012 of 50 virtual teams found that collaboration increased when people had clearly defined roles. And this slide also identifies that if we have clear processes, as identified in a 2009 study, clarity of processes will lead to increased team performance as the team is further dispersed. So the further apart they are, the more successful they'll be, as long as they have really clear processes. Now, the next process that I find works really well is managing by outcomes or managing by objectives. Some of you will have come across this term before, perhaps in your studies. We can't see what people are doing on a day-to-day basis, so we can't manage them by activity. We therefore need to manage them by the outcomes that they achieve. So if we look at the MBO process, it starts with the team leader and team member collectively setting objectives for the next 3, 6, 12 months. Those objectives are then built in to a plan that's developed again collaboratively to guide the day-to-day work of that team member. The team member is then left to implement the plan, but with regular contact, feedback, touching base, monitoring with their team leader. And then at least every 12 months, but hopefully as often as once a quarter, team leader, team member come together again, whether this is virtually or face-to-face, and evaluate performance, undertake some performance review. And then that performance review feeds into the next set of objectives, and so the process is cyclical. And my experience has been, though, that this often requires a mindset shift by team leaders. Not all team leaders are comfortable with the concept of managing by outcomes, but I have found that it really does work well in this environment. Team leaders also need to deliberately work to build one-on-one relationships. And I have found that those who do find that they have increased trust and collaboration within the team. Those who do it really well do things like contacting each team member very frequently, at least daily, and that could be through instant messaging, it could be through telephone, as well as your email, etc. They also ensure that they have some purely social conversations from time to time. So for some conversations, don't talk about the work, just have a bit of a chat focused on building trust and rapport. And this is particularly important. Each of these are particularly important with those team members who are most remote, to ensure that they don't feel lost and isolated from the team. And if possible, spend time face-to-face with your new starters. And making sure that you also replace some of those water cooler conversations, some of that incidental communication, so that you work to build trust, build it early with your new starters, and that builds a great foundation for relationships across the team. As well as one-on-one relationships, though, I've found that teams need to work deliberately to build the whole team. Ideally, this is done face-to-face, but it can also be done really well virtually, particularly with video conferencing. A public sector team that I've been working with work really hard at doing this. They spent their early team building meetings developing shared vision, values, plans, ground rules, and communication protocols. And then now they continue to include some form of team building activities in all their virtual and face-to-face team meetings. And they feel that that really has contributed to a sense of team. And if you can't meet face-to-face, there is a wide range of team building activities that can be done virtually. And there are books out there on the market that have some really, really fun and really useful examples of how you can do that. I also find that teams with shared values and ground rules are much more likely to collaborate. This slide provides an example of both team values and ground rules that were developed by a team that I worked with. You'll see that there are 5 overriding values: leadership, responsibility and integrity, respect, teamwork and creativity. Now, those words on their own, fabulous words, but are really quite open to interpretation, and the team recognised that every one of them had a different opinion on what that word meant. So they then developed the ground rules, which really spell out what are the behaviours, what does it look like when we are living these values. Now, this team developed them as a team, and each person committed to these values and ground rules. It's important that the team does that, otherwise they're not worth the paper that they're written on. They also too, though, need to agree on how are they going to call behaviour that doesn't align with these values. Actually, a United Nations volunteer team leader that I interviewed recently talked about the importance of team values in the work that he does. They usually, people who volunteer for UN work have fairly similar values, but they spend time ensuring that they do agree on their values up front, and then find that collaboration and communication then flow really well from those shared values. It's important for our individual team members to have a clear line of sight to the big picture if they're able to remain motivated, connected and engaged on a day-to-day basis. Now, this means clear links between business plans, team plans, individual performance plans. A number of the teams that I've worked with have also found that it's really quite useful to put together some form of visual of the team goals, objectives, vision, and to provide this to all team members in a format that they can display at their workstation. It then provides a constant visual reminder of what the big picture is and where that line of sight is. I've also found that successful virtual teams provide team members with opportunities to collaborate across the team. So this gives them the opportunity to build across-team one-on-one relationships, which then in turn enhances whole team collaboration. The successful virtual teams also meet often, usually virtually. A recent study actually found that video conferencing enhances engagement in virtual teams. So this would include your daily stand-ups, your weekly change advisory board meetings, retrospectives every couple of weeks, plus regular planning and review meetings. Now, those meetings that are successful tend to be very structured, which stand-ups and change advisory board meetings normally are by nature. They also have a chair and clear meeting processes and protocols. They are also generally shorter than face-to-face meetings. Something else that I find works really well is including some social interaction. Now, this is not possible for your stand-ups and your shorter meetings, but great to include some social interaction at the beginning of all of your longer meetings, just again to continue to build that rapport, give people the opportunity to get to know a little bit more about each other. Now, rituals, symbols, avatars and celebrations can also be really powerful in building the team, building a sense of team, building collaboration. One particular team that I worked with last year actually produced a map of the geographic spread of their team. Then each team member came up with an image that represented their role, their location, and something special about the team and what they contribute to it. They then went through a ritual where each team member attached their image to their location on the map and told the rest of the team what the image, the role, and the location all mean to them. And it was quite an important ritual in terms of building the team. Then once completed, they produced an electronic image of the map, and each team member now has that displayed near their workstation. And they found both the ritual and the map that was the result of that as being really important in building a strong sense of team. They actually talk about a sense of family, and the image created a really powerful reminder for each of the team members as they're working remotely. Now, I've mentioned trust a number of times already through my presentation. What tends to happen in a virtual or remote team is that they develop swift trust. This is a form of trust that's common in emergency services teams, where people assume that, okay, you're in that role, therefore you have the skills and experience to be able to form that role, and therefore I can trust you to do your job. However, one broken promise, miscommunication, or a failure to follow through will dissolve that form of trust just as quickly as it built up. So virtual ITSM teams need to work to build real trust. And research undertaken in 2012 by Murphy and Rodriguez Manzanares found that it is possible to build real trust without face-to-face contact, but it needs to be done deliberately and actively promoted. So some of the key ways that the teams that I work with build trust are: they begin their interactions with some social chat. They define their roles and their processes very clearly, as I've mentioned earlier. They communicate motivation and enthusiasm in their electronic communication, and they ensure that they follow through on processes and promises. They also find that replicating water cooler conversations is really important in building trust. So we can't do it face-to-face in the hallway, the kitchen, or by the water cooler. But what the team leaders that are successful at this tend to do is just pick up the phone regularly to each of the team members and ask, how are you going this week? How are things working out? What are you up to on the weekend? Again, some of that informal discussion. It can either be over the phone or it can be through instant messaging as well. Actually, a senior IT manager in a bank that I interviewed last year actually has virtual coffee meetings with his team members. They each head down to their local coffee shop, order their coffee, sit down and have a chat by phone. He says that they find it a little bit strange and uncomfortable at first, but once they settle into it, he finds it's a great way to have an informal conversation, and again, importantly, building those relationships. Another key element to trust is our needs and expectations, and articulating those clearly. Every one of us comes to work with a set of needs and expectations. Our needs are fairly fundamental. We need financial security, we need respect, and we need to feel a sense of belonging. On top of that, though, we usually have a set of expectations, maybe to get paid, to have regular meetings, holidays now and then, and perhaps even a fun workplace. And if those needs and expectations are met, we tend to trust the people around us. But how often do we actually let people know what our needs and expectations are? And unmet needs and expectations will result in a loss of trust. So we do need to have the one-on-one conversations with team members, team leaders, to make sure that we do clearly articulate these needs and expectations, because trust is fragile and we need to be very upfront about these things. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time now speaking generally about communication. I've picked up on a number of these points, but I just wanted to touch on these before I finish. Now, high-performing virtual teams, I find, agree on how they're going to communicate. So that would be, what are the tools we're going to use? When are we going to use those tools? When, how often are we going to meet virtually, teleconferences, face-to-face meetings? They also develop communication protocols to ensure that that communication is effective. So one example is a team that has the protocol that electronic messages will always be acknowledged within 24 hours, rather than someone leaving a message and left wondering whether that message has been received or opened at all. And they develop protocols for their virtual team meetings. So some examples of those are teams that have a rule that we put our hand up if we have a question or comment during a video conference. Simple things like we mute when we're not speaking. They also have etiquette around discouraging side conversations and discouraging in-jokes, both of which can really erode trust for remote workers. Now, there are a very wide range of tools available to us for online communication and collaboration these days. This slide's a little bit old now, 2007, but it still broadly encapsulates the types of tools we have available to us, and some are richer than others. For example, email is not a very rich form of communication at all because it contains just the content of our message. If we move to phone communication, that's richer because it includes our tone of voice as well as the message. And then if we look at video conferencing, although not perfect, it picks up the nonverbals, the body language, as well as the tone, as well as the content. And I've actually found that virtual teams with communication problems often tend to overuse email, which just exacerbates communication problems. So we need to think about what we need to communicate in each instance and choose the correct tool or tools for each situation. So the more complex or sensitive the discussion, the richer the tool needs to be. For example, feedback and performance reviews, if not face-to-face, need to at least be done by video conference so we can read the body language as well as the verbal message. So in summary, that brings me to the end of my critical success factors. So to be effective and successful as a virtual or remote ITSM team, we need to have virtual leadership, including clear vision, values, goals, and deliverables, preferably developed collaboratively and shared. We need to manage differently, manage by outcomes, and enable our staff to work autonomously. We need to work very deliberately to develop the team and to put time and resources into team building. We also need to focus on our one-on-one relationships, including engaging individual team members, building trust, and we need to be smart about how we communicate and use the range of tools that are available to us now. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you are looking for more information, please feel free to go to my website. There are some white papers, some blogs, and a range of other information there, or you can contact me via social media. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. I hope you have enjoyed, and enjoy the rest of TFT14.